Right. All right, Annette, when you're ready.
Sure, thank you, Netta, and welcome everyone to the Qualitative Research Methods, Key Approaches and Tips for Conducting Qualitative Analysis. This is the fourth of a series of qualitative seminars presented by Maternal Child Health Research Institute. Thank you for all being here. You'll see that we have our speakers all lined up for you right here. Dr. Sylvia Merrill, Dr. Javier Omar, Dr. Annie Burns, and Dr. Janine Bruce. I will give you complete bios on them after a few announcements for our MCHRI work. I first want to introduce myself. My name is Dr. Annette Nasser. I am a nurse scientist at Stanford Children's Health, and I'm also an associate professor in the Department of Pediatrics. I also have an academic clinical appointment in the Division of Transplantation. Real honor to be here. And I am also a qualitative researcher, so I'm really eager to see this lecture as well. Next slide, please. We have a few announcements coming to you from MCHRI. We first want to recognize our MCHRI Education Committee. As you can see, it's a large group, and you can see individuals that have put all of these seminars together, and we want to really commend them and acknowledge them. Thank you. Next slide. So please put on your calendars, save the date for October 24th, sorry. There you go. Thank you. We will be having our 7th annual MCHRI Symposium. It's going to take place at Stanford Lee Ka-shing Center. It's going to be a really great symposium this year with amazing keynote speakers ranging from Christopher Longhurst to our very own Sarah Cody, Health Officer for the Santa Clara County. This was all during COVID. It'll be great to have her presenting at the symposium. We have Dr. Michelle Mello from the School of Law, and we also have Dr. Langslos, who will be presenting at this 7th annual MCHR Symposium. Abstracts submissions are open, and they're due on September 4th. So we hope you all get your abstracts in. It's a great conference, so be sure not to miss that. Next slide. Okay, I think that's it for the housekeeping. I'd like to welcome our 4 keynote speakers today that are going to be talking about conducting qualitative research, specifically qualitative analysis. So Sylvia Merrill is the research scholar and co-director of scholarly concentration in medical education. She is a researcher in general pediatrics and has over 18 years of experience in high-level support of research projects at Stanford, including research design, implementation, dissemination, specifically qualitative and mixed methods research. She has significant content expertise in research areas as patient-physician communications, interoperative team communications, and language barriers. Dr. Merrill also works closely with educators to design and implement medical education curricula and research across the learning spectrum. Additional interests include capacity building and research methodology for medical students, residents, fellows, and faculty. Really happy to have you here today, Dr. Merrill. And she'll be speaking with Dr. Janine Bruce. Dr. Janine Bruce is an associate director in the Office of Child Health Equity and co-director of the scholarly concentrations in community health. Dr. Bruce is an associate, but I just said that. She received her doctorate in public health from UC Berkeley and a master's of public health from UNC at Chapel Hill. Janine has many years of experience providing leadership and administrative oversight for multiple education programs, teaching, and mentoring graduate level learners, and engaging in collaborative research aimed at eliminating child health inequities in underserved populations through thoughtful community engagement. She leads 2 community coalitions aimed at increasing communication and collaboration among community and internal partners. Janine is a co-director of the Scholarly Concentration in Community Engagement and Advocacy in the Department of Pediatrics and co-director of Scholarly Concentration in Community Health in the School of Medicine. In her teaching and mentoring roles, she values the opportunity to support students and trainees as they work closely with community partners to address community-identified needs, bringing the support and partnership from our academic institution. She also teaches courses on social determinants of health and qualitative research methods. Her research and advocacy interests include food insecurity, early education, and the needs of marginalized communities. With her background in public health, Janine's role has been a bridge to public health, and medicine to better promote the health of underserved child populations through strong community partnerships and innovative community-based initiatives. We are so happy to have Dr. Merrill and Dr. Bruce to kick off this seminar. I think I'm going to wait and give the bios for our next speakers when they come up. Would that be okay? Yes? Okay.
Perfect.
Is that okay? We're going to have Dr. Annie Burnens, who's we'll introduce them when they come. I think that's a lot of bio for now. And let's have Janine, Dr. Bruce, and Dr. Merrill kick it off. Nice to have you both.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the kind introductions. I'll go ahead and get us kicked off. Welcome to this session. We're excited to have so many of you here with us today. But before we get started, we just want to acknowledge that Stanford sits on the ancestral land of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone people. And so consistent with our values of community and inclusion, we have the responsibility to honor and make visible the university's relationship with Native peoples, not only locally to Stanford, but globally. So today in this presentation, we'll really focus on describing some qualitative analysis methods. We'll discuss different analytical approaches to better understand both content and theme analysis. And we'll review some kind of detailed analytic processes. And then Annie and Javier will really bring it all together with an example from their work. So Sylvia.
Thank you so much. Welcome everybody, and good afternoon. And thank you to Annette and Janine and the MCHRA team. So we'll start off with talking about different types of analytic reasoning. And as far as qualitative analysis and qualitative research in general goes, there's no established or standardized protocol as we embark on our qualitative analysis journeys. This tends to be a fluid process and is highly dependent on the research question, the way that data were collected, and as well as what type of resources that you're utilizing to conduct the data analysis. So you might also, under certain circumstances, modify or change how you approach your analytic process, and that is something that you might be able to build into your analytic plans. That is to say, there are multiple methods of discovery. We have something called deductive, inductive, and we can also have combined approaches, which I'll discuss next. This is just a quick visual to show you how we might have different starting points. We might have something where we start with our data and we move inductively to apply to our data sets and develop into theory. And we might start with theory, utilize it deductively, and apply it to our data. Inductively specifically begins with developing your codes by reading the transcript. So it's something that's inductive process. It really incorporates your data itself. You apply codes as they emerge and they start to crystallize in you or your co-researchers thinking about your data set. You might refine some of these codes and then you might reapply them, and you start building from your data up. So this just means that as the inductive approach is generating codes from the data, and then you continuously refine as you have a more systematically developed and stable code book. Specifically, what this means is that you start with your data, you then identify these emerging codes, and you can then might later on consider how it fits into the literature, see if it applies, see if there's other ideas out there that you're finding similar types of responses to. For example, we might have a research question that might be, this is a body of work I've done in the past, how do students define mistreatment during clerkships? When we're practically looking at inductively applying codes, we develop the code book itself from the data. We're not being influenced by another framework or outside theory, and we develop and refine a code book as it comes from the data point. And once we have a final code book and we begin our analysis process, we might say to ourselves, how does this relate or compare to the ACGME mistreatment definitions? If we were to do a similar process deductively, what this means is we develop our codes from the theory The question domains from our interview guide might also have been influenced by that specific theory itself from prior literature. So you start developing codes based on the theory, and then you apply that to your data set. They still might need to be refined and adapted to your own analytic work, and as well as your own transcripts, but you start from the theory standpoint. So your codes themselves are developed on prior literature or theory, and then you apply that to your data through the codes. So your research question is the same, right? How do students define mistreatment during clerkships? A deductive approach might mean that you develop your codebook initially based on the ACGME definitions of mistreatment, and then you apply that to the student statements. And then you might say to yourself, I'm missing other people's statements or other types of statements that don't nicely fit in to these definitions. And that's why we might do a more combined approach. Which would be this, like you might think to yourself, I want to start completely inductively. I want to really hear what the participants are saying, start the codebook development. You might find yourself feeling that what you're identifying as codes is really resonating from something out in the world in literature. And then you might bring in either definitions or actual verbiage from theory. And this would be a combined analytic, deductive and inductive code book development process. So you really should consider using your research question to guide how you embark on your analytic reasoning approach. If you want to start with the data, you really want to sort of dive into what your participants are saying. This might be more of an exploratory research project or novel research project of itself. This is you might consider an inductive coding or code development approach. If you have some prior knowledge, or if you're trying to build or explain something or have a more explanatory research project to see what is going on, you might start deductively, but you're also not limited to those two. You might utilize a combined approach. This might help enhance the rigor and findings, as well as help build your definitions of what these codes might mean in a stronger way. But really consider how you do this analytic approach before you start your analytic process. Having a plan in place is always recommended. So there are multiple research methods that you may use during your qualitative analysis process. There are some practical ways to think about, how do we analyze our qualitative data? There's some considerations are, what is your philosophical approach? How do you approach your data analysis? And that's something that we'll be talking about in the next few slides. But there's also process elements, right? Are you considering working with a team? Who's involved in your team and when and how? How might you be utilizing software? Which features make sense for your project? And none of these are exclusive, right? These are some things that you might consider as you're building your analytic method section of either your proposals or your projects, where you might be incorporating various elements of these to strengthen and enhance the rigor of your project. Some philosophical approaches of coding. We start with something called a generic qualitative research. This is where you might be investigating opinions, attitudes, beliefs, reflections, or experiences. And then there's also a number of known other qualitative philosophical approaches, such as phenomenological, which is a description of a shared meaning across a group of people. Narrative is using individual stories from people, hearing about their own experiences and own meanings of something that impacted them, such as a policy or an experience. Ethnographic approaches is usually done through a systematic observation across varying degrees of inclusion into a group or a system. Case studies might be looking at how one process or one system is functioning, seeing where there's breaks in the system and when things are going really well. And this tends to be using sources from lots of different sources, actually. So different types of data and different sources. So this could be considered inclusion of mixed methods research. Of course, there's action research with using community knowledge, and then a grounded theory approach in an iterative data collection and then analysis, and then data collection analysis process. Most of the research that we tend to do, Janine and I, is in this generic qualitative research and phenomenological buckets. So the approaches to qualitative analysis itself. As we may have started, since there's no one right way to, or not one known exact way to do a qualitative analysis approach, this is highly dependent on how you want to consider all the different ways that you've collected and want to analyze your data. So your approach might be a balance of how the data were collected, what your research question is, how that question may have evolved over time, how you want to present the data, right? Some people might want to present the data in different forms, and so that's how you might want to be considering your analytic approach. And then what is meaningful about the research? The so what of that, and all of this, of course, is interconnected. The two that we'll talk about today are one of the two main approaches that we utilize. One is thematic analysis, and the other one is content analysis. Thematic analysis is a type of analysis, and this is just a big overview. I'll go into specifics in a little bit. So thematic analysis is a research technique that organizes and reorganizes data, and you really use that to uncover these patterns or themes to identify different ideas that are happening across your data set, across your data sources, across participants, across groups, right? You're sort of lumping ideas together, and the numeric frequencies of them generally do not impact this. It's in terms of what makes a theme, it really is sort of like you're trying to identify the various elements of what it is that you're researching and those experiences that are important to that group. Content analysis is another research technique where you do more of a systematic or quantitative description of the data. You're quantifying essentially the topics of interest that are spread across your participants and across various groups, for example. And then you can also do something called a combined approach, where you might do this in combination or in parallel, where you are basically collecting information in both types of ways. But you have to also understand that either one of these should be helping you answer your research question itself. So for thematic analysis, the aims and goals tend to be in this identification or reporting of these patterns or themes that are occurring. It might be an exploratory way to capture a range of responses and to collate them and put them into some sort of significance. The types of questions and data that are collected, they tend to be traditionally open-ended questions. The data might be broad. The questions themselves might be really broad. And what you're looking for are insights and perspectives. And the process itself for this could be a mix of either deductive or inductive code development, but it tends to also be a multi-step process to determine these patterns and themes. And it requires reading of the text. Content analysis itself, the aims and goals of this approach is this like systematic categorization of text. You might be collecting frequency counts of codes that are applied across data sources or participants. It's this quantification of qualitative categories. So you still might have some qualitative categories, but you want to see how often they occur across the various groups of people. So this is usually done when there's a finite type of responses, such as survey questions, or that you ensure that this question was asked because you knew in advance that you wanted to quantify this information. It could be types of lists or categories. This type of analysis is ideal for a large number of responses, just because this is a good way to very quickly scan your qualitative data, get some quantification of broad categories, and it might actually help you identify what you want to do a deeper dive for the thematic analysis for. The analytic process itself for content analysis follows a very specific controlled code book development. You can't start counting things until you know what you're counting, right? So you have to predetermine your code book in advance. You can still develop the code book iteratively. However, once you start this application, they should be a stable code book. And again, it requires reading of text. So when you're thinking about your own data, think about how were the data collected? Were all of your interview questions unstructured or semi-structured? Did you ask all of the questions to every single participant? How do you envision sharing your findings? Are you envisioning sharing the elegant themes that are laid out and showing sort of what's happening across these group of people? Or are you trying to identify frequency counts and seeing, you know, if something is happening to every single person or nobody in your group? Review how you might approach this analysis process before you're developing your codes, because codes might differ if they're counted, right? You might have a different definition of a code if it's counted, rather than having it be, you know, working its way into becoming a theme. You also might have this combined analytic approach, as we talked about, for this code development. So consider the big picture, what your output might be before identifying sort of like if you're in one specific camp or another. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Sylvia. I will jump into talking about a little bit more about the process from codes to themes, getting into a few more details. This is something that we hear very commonly from students that we work with, collaborators, is the overwhelmed with the amount of data after data collection. And so the feeling of where to begin, there's a lot of key things that you have to do just to prepare for the analysis process. The most important things are getting your data transcribed and translated, cleaning your data and de-identifying it prior to analysis. There's a lot of nuances that go in these first two steps that we won't have time to go into today, but just know that these are considered important things to think about prior to actually sitting down to look at your data. You want to have all of this taken care of before you enter the data into any qualitative software or engaging in a more manual analysis process. And as Sylvia talked earlier, some key resources and things to consider are how you're going to identify and mobilize the coders, who's really part of the team, as Sylvia mentioned. Might you involve some content experts or participants to help with some validation or perspective, and then also having a really detailed and thoughtful analysis plan and timeline. So in terms of the analysis process, a very simplified way to think about it is moving both from the real to the abstract and also from the particular to the general. And so what we mean by that is coding is really just the first step in the analysis process. You need to get the data coded, and what that means is you're going to start to see the data from, you know, kind of these very narrative transcripts, and you're going to start to lump data into codes, and those codes are labels that you're going to assign. You're going to think about what that chunk of data means, what symbolic meaning or descriptive meaning that data holds. The codes may also be a way to prompt or trigger deeper reflection as you start to really organize and understand the data you see. And then for content analysis, it can be this way to start to see some of these repeating ideas that you may want to eventually do frequency counts and do that quasi-quantification. So in terms of what a code could be, it could really be anything from a word to a phrase, because it's what you are ascribing in terms of the meaning to that piece of data. And you'll see kind of trends across your data set, and these codes will start to really emerge and solidify after you read several transcripts. So there's going to be a lot of iteration as you develop your codes in your code book, but you could have a very simple code that is communication. Or if you want to give it a little bit more meaning, it might be communication challenges. But really, there's no right or wrong answers, and there's a lot of extensive literature about out there that talks in more detail about what a code might be and what meaning you're ascribing to it. Now, going back to the process that Sylvia was talking about with theme analysis, is once you have these codes, you're going to start to very naturally see some patterns emerge. And so by reviewing individual or groups of codes, you're going to start to see patterns that are going to start to, indicate some more abstract or more specific ideas emerging. And from there, you're going to pull codes, particular codes, and that's where you get to start doing the theme analysis. So the theme analysis is really the second part of the process where you're going to take a particular code that has excerpts from multiple transcripts from across your data set, and you're going to look at them all together and start to identify themes and possibly sub-themes. And so the themes are really this articulation of larger ideas that are present in your data. And they are also the outcomes of the coding and analytic process overall. All right, so just visually thinking about how you might go from codes to theme is imagine all of these little snippets from across your transcript that you're going to put into these different coding piles. And it's from these coding piles that you might see one or more themes emerge. You might see some themes that cross codes 1 and 2. So you're going to start to see your data kind of coalescing potentially. And so that's where you're going to really get from this process of having these codes to multiple themes across your data set. And lastly, you're going to see some potential aggregation across different related themes that you may want to collapse under a particular domain heading. And I use domains as a way to think about large conceptual ideas that really signify related themes together. So how can themes and categories be represented? It can really be so much. It can be words, phrases, sentences, characterizations, maybe actually some relationships that you might show visually. It could be a process. And these can all be really represented in so many different ways. You may take these themes and have them in tables. You might have matrices that compare and contrast different elements of the data. You can have your themes embedded in the text and so forth. And as I mentioned, you may have process maps or figures that really show relationships and processes across the data as well. And so that's really going to be part of the synthesis process, is not only identifying these themes, but figuring out the relationship between these themes, how they fit together, what they represent. That is an extension of the analysis process. And so, you know, it's really difficult for people to kind of take that first stab at thinking about what is my theme? What am I seeing here? Themes can be very abstract and often difficult to identify, and it takes time. And so what Sylvia and I often tell the students in our class is that, you know, trust your gut. You're very steeped in your data. You're very knowledgeable with your data and the data collection and your participants. And so just imagine and see what is rising to the surface. Don't spend a lot of initial time trying to say, what is the perfect theme? Is get down what your gut is telling you that you're seeing in the data, and then come back multiple times to review that, to get other people's input, to refine that. And that is also part of the very iterative process of developing your theme. And then, you know, think about your themes and findings in a larger context. What do they mean to the field that you're in? What do they mean for the participants who were engaged? And so that's going to put your findings in a larger context as well. And then really look to see what parts of your data might be linked, what parts can be part of a bigger picture that you're wanting to tell. And so ultimately, throughout this analysis process, as you develop these themes, you're going to be telling a story with the data, and you're going to bring it together in a way that hopefully really is a good representation of what your participants had to say. And so that's kind of, you know, a snapshot of thinking about the theme analysis. The content analysis is similar in some ways in that you will code your data and you're going to look for categories. Instead of more abstract patterns, you might see more structured categories emerging. So you're going to take these codes and just like you did in the theme analysis, you're going to start to group them into meaningful categories. And then you'll start to see potential subcategories emerge. Oops, excuse me. And then what's really different here is that you can do that quasi-quantification where you can start to look at the data within these categories and start to represent them in a numerical way. You can do that quasi-quantification. And so what you might have is tables that have frequencies and matrices that really demonstrate kind of the degree to what you're seeing within the data. Okay, so similar to the other slide is that you're going to have these codes, you're going to have these categories that encapsulate one or more codes, but then you also might be able to ascribe some quantifiable element to it. So this is a quantification of qualitative data. And then comparing the two processes, they're quite similar, but with some small nuances in terms of the level of structure that you might have in content analysis, and then the outputs of the data itself. So how these processes are similar but yet divergent is that the coding, you really are beginning with a similar foundation in your qualitative coding. As Sylvia mentioned earlier, you can really have a foundation that is inductive, deductive, or a combined approach. You're going to sort and group that data throughout the coding process. You're going to see these patterns and structured categories across the data. And really where the findings diverge is in how you are representing and displaying your data. So with the theme analysis, your codes are going to really demonstrate a potential topic or theme area, and then you're going to have supporting quotes that are describing what you're seeing. You are going to, really spend some time iteratively reviewing and modifying these themes until you feel like you have the best representation of the data. And then you're going to generate what are hopefully really nicely defined, succinct themes and statements that are going to tell your story. And with the content analysis, again, you'll have those trends and patterns and frequencies and relationships. You'll have those frequencies and counts. And then you can have really a lot of different ways to display the data. And then there's some potential ways to actually bring these two elements together in maybe a shared table that not only demonstrates the content piece and the quasi-quantification of your data, but also some themes that might emerge within a particular structured category. All right. So the fun part is really reporting your findings, whether you're doing a detailed theme analysis or content analysis. You want to capture the relevant themes that really exemplify what your data are showing and how are they answering your research question. So with theme analysis, I think many of you are probably familiar with reading qualitative papers that have beautiful, lovely articulated themes that are nicely organized. You may see a table of themes and quotes. You may see some comparisons in a table that compare and contrast across different participants or different characteristics among your participant group. And then again, you can use the themes that emerge to visually demonstrate relationships and processes. And what I love about content analysis is you have a lot of these similar elements, but you have the added element of the frequencies that can, tell an additional story to your data as well. So unfortunately, we don't have a chance to go into a lot of the different ways to visualize and represent data, but here's a very simple and lovely example of a thematic analysis with some narrative, some themes, description, and some narrative quotes. So you can see here there's 3 overarching themes: communication, insight, and hope. And this was a study of medical students. And so there's a discussion after the theme where it's talking about kind of the specific elements of what goes into that particular theme. And then it's followed by an exemplary quote. And so they followed this pattern throughout the different themes. You know, you could have sub-themes here if you wanted, that you wanted to flesh out. There's really an endless number of ways to depict your data, but what I like to do is I like to look at other studies to get inspiration, but ultimately what the researcher is presenting here is their synthesis of their findings theme by theme, and they're using the narrative descriptions to describe and really elaborate more on what is present within this particular theme. And then they have this representative quote. And a very, very simple example of content analysis. This is something that is a little bit different in that this author chose to demonstrate the code name, which for this student actually was a good kind of representation of a particular overarching idea, or even you could have called it a theme. They have a definition, but they used the codes as a way to determine the frequency count. So how many times this idea of interpersonal communication came up across their unique participants, and then they have an example quote. But again, there are endless ways to demonstrate your data. And as you embark on this process, you really want to think about how you want to handle your data, what type of analysis you're doing, the kind of fundamentals of margin coding or using software. There's pros and cons to each approach, and you as the PI in your study get to kind of make some recommendations and discuss it with your team and identify what process works best for you. You also want to, again, think about who is involved in that process. And it goes beyond just bringing together whoever's available. It's really an opportunity to increase the credibility of your findings by bringing in outside unique perspectives, recognizing the complexity of your data. You may want to be very strategic in thinking about who's involved in your process. And then lastly, consider if your work is grounded theory, and that if that's the approach that you took, you may have multiple iterations of your data collection and analysis and summary of the data as you start to generate that conceptual theory or idea that will be kind of the hallmark of your findings. This tends to be a longer process, and folks may not have that as a goal to end their work with a conceptual idea or theory or proposed theory, but some do and have the ability and time and resources to do that. I'm going to very, very briefly talk about qualitative software. There are multiple different softwares out there. There's a handful. And what you should know about software is the software out there does not do the analysis for you. It really is a way to store, organize, and retrieve information. Now, some of the software out there can do really great things. They can show you code co-occurrence. They can show you visually, some of the relationships that might be there through different diagramming and things that software can do. but the ultimate interpretation and how the software works is really up to you. It can do things like simple word counts, but that could help facilitate a content analysis. But as I mentioned earlier in the chat, you really have to be very careful and thoughtful when you're doing content analysis and using a software like NVivo or Deduce to do that, to help you do that, because you want to make sure that just in choosing a particular word and saying, oh, I'm going to count all of the instances where communication was brought up. Well, that's going to capture some of it, but it may not capture the nuanced ways that people talk about communication without actually using the word communication. So it can do wonderful things. You can have multiple coders. You can do inter-rater reliability, which can demonstrate the credibility of the coding process. But again, it does not do the analysis for you. In the work that Sylvia and I do collaboratively and in the class that we teach, we recommend using Deduce. We find that Deduce is a great option when you have multiple collaborators across institutions globally. It's pretty accessible and it's relatively inexpensive for people who don't have easy access to NVivo licenses. All right. Well, I'm going to stop there and give our MCHRI grantees the opportunity to talk about their work. And Dr. Nassar, I believe you wanted to do a more thorough introduction at this point. Is that correct?
Sure. Yes. Great presentation. And thank you, Dr. Bruce. Why don't we open it up for, do we want to save our questions to the end? I think we did want to save our questions to the end. Is that right?
Yes, I think that was the plan.
Perfect. So I want to thank both Dr. Merrill and Dr. Bruce for that wonderful, wonderful presentation, taking a very complex concept and really simplifying and making it very, very clear and digestible. So thank you very much. It gives me great pleasure. Before I introduce our next two speakers, I want to kind of tip my hat to the organizers of this symposium, which I forgot to mention at the beginning: Dongmei Tan, Anisha Patel, Netta Miller, and Janine and Sylvia. I'd like to thank all of you for putting the energies into making this seminar come to life. So thank you very much for that. So we're going to move into the second part of this qualitative research methods seminar with our two speakers, Javier Omar and Annie Burns. Dr. Burns comes to us she's a research director of Anado Latinos Asanar. She is a developmental behavioral pediatrician who recently completed a clinical and postdoctoral research fellowship at Stanford and now serves as the director of Anado Latino Sanar, which is also called ALAS. ALAS is a community organization in Half Moon Bay that provides mental health care, cultural arts programs, advocacy, and wraparound social support for largely farm worker communities on California's Central Coast. Research activities at ALAS focus on generating evidence to inform services and policy, and to tell the story of the community through research. Using community-based and participatory practices, Dr. Behrens also has a private practice and lives with her family in Menlo Park. Javier Omar is a PhD candidate in developmental and psychological sciences. He is originally from Miami, Florida, and the son of two Cuban immigrants. He is currently a doctoral candidate in developmental and psychological sciences at Stanford's Graduate School of Education. Prior to this, Javier taught secondary science in the San Antonio Independent School District. He received his Bachelor's of Science in Neuroscience and Behavioral Biology and a BA in Human Health from Emory University. His research leverages mixed methods, strengths-based and community-based participatory approaches to examining the social and emotional and psychosocial development of culturally and linguistically diverse children. His current work is situated within the San Francisco Unified School District Partnership. It broadly focuses on assessing emotional knowledge development across a diverse cohort of preschoolers and examining the role of teacher beliefs and biases on social emotional learning practices and student outcomes. Additionally, he is currently involved in a multi-institutional community-driven project focused on developing and validating a measure of youth immigration-related stress, trauma, and strength, where he is leading a qualitative study to explore how caregivers and youth perceive the impact of immigration-related experiences on youth psychosocial development and mental health. What an amazing, amazing bios for both of these speakers. Thank you for being here. And please, let's hear from, I believe Javier is going to be first. Or is it Dr. Behrens?
Yeah, I'll jump in first. We're going to sort of
Thank you.
popcorn back and forth. Javier and I have been working together on this project for, gosh, almost for a long time now. So we'll, yeah, share and then happy to answer questions at the end. So yeah, there's a little bit of information about this project kind of in the bios, but this is, we'll be sharing a little bit about our qualitative analysis experience for an MCHRI funded portion of this larger project that's broadly focused on kind of looking at the developmental and psychosocial impacts of immigration-related stress, trauma, and strengths among youth. Next slide. Oh, and sorry, quick, shout out to many collaborators on this. Jelena Obradovich is the faculty lead at the School of Education and Javier's PhD mentor, and Belinda Hernandez Arriaga is the director of ALAS, and another, she's at University of San Francisco and also has been kind of a key thought leader in this work. So as I mentioned, this project was funded by MCHRI. Very grateful for their community engagement grant and the amazing programming and support that that team has put together. And we have no financial interest to disclose. So the background for this study, I think we're kind of broadly, it was the coming together of some researchers from, I'm in developmental behavioral pediatrics. Dr. Hernandez Arriaga is in education, but has a background in child therapy, and then others in the education field. So we're really broadly interested in how migration experiences influence youth mental health and well-being, and acknowledging that migration contexts can expose both youth and caregivers to acute and chronic forms of stress. And then post-migration, there can be social structural challenges across many domains. But also recognizing that the findings in the literature looking at relationships between migration and mental health are really complex. There are some studies that have documented better mental health among Latina immigrants compared to non-Latina and non-immigrant white individuals, and others that have found increased risk of, in particular, internalizing and trauma-related conditions in some populations. So we're really trying to step back and take a very kind of nuanced and also strengths-based approach that looks at not only the kind of stressors and sometimes traumatic events that can go along with migration, but also a wide array of strengths and assets and like positive dimensions that can contribute to psychosocial development. Next slide. As was mentioned in the beginning, this is part of a bigger parent study that's looking at informing the development of a measure that we're hoping can be used in both research and clinical contexts. So eventually, this qualitative phase building into the development of a questionnaire-based quantitative measure that will be used to look at these three dimensions of stress, trauma, and strengths as they impact youth mental health. Next slide. So the qualitative study was really looking to understand both youth and parent perspectives about the effects of immigration experiences on psychosocial development and well-being among Latina immigrant youth in the Bay Area, and to explore perspectives on strengths and processes that support healing. We'll briefly step back, I think, for this project, especially as someone who's not an immigrant and not Latina identifying. So I think the positionality of the different team members on this project was really important to us to think about as we approached the analysis process, the whole process from design to analysis to sharing results. So Javier is going to share a little bit about his background. I'll share about mine, but then also we'll talk about how we tried to develop kind of a team that brought a lot of different perspectives and positions coming into the work. So Javier.
Sounds great. Thank you, Annie. And going off that, I think Annie and I both really are intentional about trying to humanize the research process as much as possible. And part of that requires humanizing ourselves. And that's so another reason we wanted to kind of front and center have our positionalities before we talk about the analysis and the theoretical models that we're thinking of. So my name's Javier. I grew up as the son of two Cuban immigrants in Miami, Florida, living in a multi-generational household. I was primarily raised by my mom and my grandma, which are the two lovely humans represented in those pictures. I'm the youngest of three siblings, and I'm the only natural-born citizen in my family. And all those things really shaped my childhood and shape how I navigated the world, and also shape and fuel my current research interest and how and why I do my work. So yeah, I wanted to give a quick overview of me, and I'll give it back to Annie.
Yeah, so I'm Annie. I also grew up in a multi-generational household in the Boston area. And I would say I come into this aware of bring a lot of kind of academic privilege from my background. My parents were both academics in economics and public policy. My mom actually did do immigration policy research as part of her career. She grew up in Brazil, but her family's from the US. So definitely like a lot of humility around everything that I have to learn going into this space of not having shared a lot of these experiences around immigration, not speaking Spanish. I struggle along a little bit. Javier can attest, it's not pretty, but yeah, but also really influenced by my experiences as a developmental behavioral pediatrician and a mom, and found that still creates like really deep, opportunities for connections and experiences in doing this work. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit, kind of tying into the other parts of this talk. In a minute, Javier is going to talk in a lot more depth about the design. I know the focus of today is more on the analysis, so we'll kind of do this to set up how we think about the analysis. So this is just one slide to kind of represent one example of theoretical influences that we brought going into this project. So we definitely took a more inductive approach to a thematic analysis, but even acknowledging that, we kind of our approach to, it's never coming out of a vacuum. So even if you're trying to go in and take a deductive approach from the data, we were kind of intentional about acknowledging what were the theories that were probably shaping the lenses through which we saw the data, and that we might, like, whatever emerges from our data, what might we put, what other theories, what might we put it in conversation with. So I think in general, this is just one example of, there were other theories too that we drew on, but as we tried to think about, how would we think about experiences of stress, trauma, and strengths across different settings, we definitely drew on something like an ecological systems approach, which is influenced by Bronfenbrenner as far as thinking about how we could structure a child's environment. So so just a way of thinking about how different experiences, starting at the level of the individual and individual characteristics, and then think about caregiver and family contexts, community contexts, societal contexts, and like broader social structural contexts that influence the child also over time. So thinking about like the chronosystem is what it's sometimes called, from pre-migration to post-migration contexts. We draw on other theories, but this is just an example of one that I would say shaped our approach to, or it's probably there in the back of our minds as we were trying to take a more inductive approach to the data. Slide. So now I'll pass it over to Javier to talk in more detail about the data collection and those sorts of methods issues, which can be helpful for then understanding the analysis.
Thank you, Annie. So I'll quickly go through the data collection so we can spend a little bit more time on the data analysis portion of the presentation. So we recruited first-generation Latina immigrant parents and caregivers, and first and second-generation Latina immigrant youth and young adults ranging from 18 to 24. And we recruited folks through our community partners, with most of our participants coming from our primary community partner, ALAS, Ayudando Latinos a Soñar. But we also want to recognize that we've worked with refugee and immigrant transitions and Raíces y Cariño. As in terms of the data sources, we did in-depth, semi-structured, and multimodal qualitative interviews. And the multimodal aspect of it is that throughout the interview process, we did allow folks to draw when it felt like that would be helpful for them to process their story, because we wanted to ensure that we gave folks as many opportunities as possible to share their stories in the most authentic way to themselves, in the most authentic way. The interviews centered around their pre, peri, and post-migration experiences. We tried to have a balance of asking about sources of stress and trauma alongside sources of hope, healing, resistance, and joy to get a really comprehensive and nuanced and messy understanding of their lived reality and their journey across all these different kind of migration domains. So next slide. And this just gives you a little bit more of a breakdown of our participants. We had 11 parents, caregivers, and 8 youth, young adults, mostly a large portion of folks with their country of origin being from Mexico, but we also have some Central and South American countries represented as well. And most of the interviews were conducted in folks' native language, so in Spanish, with a few being conducted in English, and we had a roughly equal balance of the two genders represented. And this is just a visual display of what I just said in case folks have a preference for looking at these paradigms in a more visual way. So I don't want to spend too much time on that because that was already covered. So we can kind of move on to the next slide. Somewhat out of order, but that's okay. We'll go along with it. So we want to acknowledge that we're going to be speaking on 2 separate papers here that come from the same qualitative data source. Given the really richness and the depth of the data that we collected, there was just so much there that we felt it was necessary to kind of divide this into separate kind of projects so that we can really make sure that we're honoring the stories and voices of the folks that gave us the privilege of hearing their stories. Awesome. It would have been helpful if potentially there's a slide, another data analysis slide that might have been missed.
I think there might have been one slide that got
Oh,
there.
beautiful. That's the one. That's the one that kind of describes more. No worries at all. Thank you so much. So this slide kind of gives you a breakdown of our approach, which has kind of been mentioned prior. But as a team, we decided that we wanted to engage in a constructivist grounded theory approach to ensure that the code and theme development process kind of fully embedded the youth and caregivers agency, humanity, and lived realities. We really wanted to make sure that the data was speaking for itself and that we weren't embedding biases and our perceptions into the data analysis process. As Annie did mention, we did think of theoretical models that would kind of map onto and that would map onto some of the data analysis, but we tried as best as possible to let the data speak for itself. We also chose this approach because we recognize that immigrant communities and their stories and lived experiences are not fully represented in the research process. And so we wanted to really center and highlight and honor those stories as best as possible and as authentically as possible without us kind of influencing that. And so as part of that constructivist grounded theory approach, there's kind of 3 phases, these 3 iterative phases. The first one being the open descriptive coding, which as best as possible, we went through line by line of each transcript and tried to kind of break down the transcript into these discrete kind of buckets and categories, and as best as possible using the language of the interview to kind of create these buckets. After we kind of fully fleshed out the descriptive codebook, as a team, we kind of moved into the axial coding portion of our process, which is now kind of the phase where we try to kind of make these connections between these discrete parts and try to kind of make more concrete categories and subcategories and try to start looking at the relationships and interactions between them. And then the last part, the selective coding part, which in some ways for us kind of blurred together with the axial part, is when you try to kind of integrate all these categories and subcategories into kind of a cohesive story and narrative to create kind of an overarching theory from the data. And like Annie said, our coding team was representative, a kind of a diverse range of backgrounds and positionalities, both immigrant, non-immigrant, and various generations of immigrants were included in the data analysis phase. And so we got a really wealth of perspectives from folks as we kind of deliberated throughout these kind of iterative processes. And we're currently kind of going through the member checking phase of this analysis, where we're going back into the community and showing them these kind of this broad theory that we have conceptualized using the interview data and making sure that it aligns well with what they shared with us, because we want to make sure that whatever we've created based on the data really aligns with what they shared with us. And that's an ongoing process that we're doing in the community. And I think we can move on to the next phase. Beautiful. And so out of that kind of coding process and that analysis process, we've kind of developed this broad theory of development for Latina youth. And it's hard to see, but this idea of this tapestry came out of an interview we conducted with one of the youth. And they had shared this practice of like weaving traditional culturally specific clothing. And it was a practice that they wanted to remember because it was something that their grandma had taught them, and they wanted to kind of keep that link both to their familial, like both the link to their family, but also the link to their broader cultural identity and cultural tradition. And I'm actually going to read that quote because I do think it's a fairly powerful quote. And then I'll kind of delve into more of this theoretical model. And so the quote is, "I talked to my mom about the clothes that we wear. I wanted to make them again because I didn't want to forget it, how to do it by hand. I wanted to make them. I weaved for almost like 2 years. I felt that it was easier for me because my grandmother taught me from before." So again, it's kind of emphasizing this connection to family and also this broader connection to culture, which is we see as a really restorative process for youth. And so I'll quickly kind of break down this model because I know there's a lot here. And it's kind of anchored in these two broad domains. One is at the bottom, which encompasses the systems of oppression and violence. And the other is at the top, which encompasses these radical forms of healing, hope, and resistance, which was exemplified in that quote that I shared with you. And within these kind of two anchors, we have these four broad themes and buckets of that exist here. And I guess I should spend a little bit of time just talking about the tapestry. The holes represent kind of these ruptures that we see due to these kind of systemic pressures that may be harmful to youth and their families. And then that needle and thread weaving together those holes kind of represent the active forms of strength and resistance that youth and their families engage in day to day as they kind of navigate these systemically oppressive and violent systems. And I think I'll leave it there in terms of time. So that's just kind of a broad overview of this theoretical model that we kind of derive from our analytic approach.
And I can just talk, I know that, yeah, I want to make sure we leave time for questions, but I can just talk, I think, to highlight, since I imagine this is something that probably comes up for other teams and something to wrestle with during the analysis phase, is when you have an extremely rich data set where there's so many different ways that you could slice the themes. It's like you could write endlessly on all the different topics and themes that came up in these interviews. How do you parse that? Is it, can you do multiple analyses from the same paper? And we ended up deciding to do that partly because we took it was in kind of designing the study with our community partner. There was a lot of feedback around wanting to give the participant a lot of control over how they share their stories, and taking something that's called like a testimonial approach. We weren't quite like true testimonials, which is more someone just like kind of in a fairly open-ended way, just sharing their story. But we tried to make our questions like quite open-ended and really give participants a lot of flexibility as far as just like sharing their experience and what they wanted to say. Because of that, the amount of different themes that come up are endless. Like it was so rich. So we did end up feeling like we just couldn't do it justice in one paper, and are kind of chipping away at it and explore. It's sort of like a diamond that you can look at from many different angles, is one way I think about it. So we are working on another paper that just is really trying to explore and tease out more some themes that came up around ideas of attachment. So especially thinking about people experiencing kind of mixed status family stress, so documentation related stress where there's a threatened rupture in a parent-caregiver relationship or in family relationships, and then just all of the kind of dislocations that can go with the big changes of a migration journey. So that's something that we're exploring further. So this is something further, we're calling it the tapestry of attachment. We can go on to the next slide. And yeah, here this came out of, like I said, some quotes that are really just describing how there can be a kind of traumatic dislocation that can go along with a migration journey. Not for everyone, but how it's often a kind of sudden disconnection from lots of different dimensions of identity and experience. So this was one participant. I can read the quote. So it says, "I do remember that when they came and picked me up, my grandparents were crying and I was holding to my grandma. I remember that she would cover herself with a shawl and I'm saying like, Mom, I don't want to go. I don't want to go. Don't leave me. Don't leave me. I don't know her. I cried the entire way. When I arrived, I remembered we stopped to get milk, and I'll never forget this because I'm like, oh, we're going to get milk. And I thought it was going to be on a farm. And I'm like, my mom doesn't have a pot, so we can't carry the milk, and not understanding everything, going to the store and seeing the gallon of milk. And I'm like, this is not milk, this is water. Then coming to our apartment and meeting my dad, I'm like, this is not my dad. I don't know who he is. Why should I be hugging him? So many things. Like this looked like a big city for me compared to a small town. I remember the first night I couldn't sleep. The blankets felt different. The bed felt different. I was used to sleeping with my grandma, like literally holding her, and I couldn't stop crying. So that's a pretty like wrenching quote. And this is just one example. You can go on to the next slide of, I won't read these in full, but also, yeah, like I mentioned, some themes that came up around the kind of traumatic fear of family separation in the setting of mixed status families, and then also people who did experience family separation. Next slide. But then also this really positive dimension, like the quote that Javier shared of how these like really rich, multi-layered connections with many dimensions of, relationships and identity in place, is also a source of resilience and strength. And that some of the practices that we saw both in individuals and in our partner organizations were kind of focused on like repairing that tapestry of attachment, creating opportunities for connection to culture, for connecting across generations. So ALAS, the organization where we work, has these cultural arts programs like dance and ballet folklorico and mariachi groups for kids. And it's this beautiful opportunity, both to connect with cultural traditions in a space of a lot of pride, but also, often it's like the grandma will be making the costumes for the kids. And it's this form of also relational connection across families. So go to the next slide. So this is kind of another theory that emerged from thinking about both the role of attachment in stressful and traumatic experiences, but also as a form of strength and healing. And we're basically just kind of still developing and playing with this theme of that a lot of attachment literature, if you're familiar with that literature in child development spaces, it tends to be very dyadic, focused on like a child and caregiver. But really kind of reconceptualizing attachment is something that happens like not just with a single caregiver, but with an entire network, with multiple caregivers, especially in more multi-generational families, and then embedded in a time and place and social context. And that these sort of cultural sensory experiences, we call them, cut across these different layers and can be both, really vivid parts of the experiences of those dislocation, but also parts of the healing experience, the experiences with dance and music or weaving tapestries with like especially powerful and healing for folks. So I know we're over time, but yeah, that's our other model.
Thank you, Dr. Behrens. Thank you, Javier. Really nice presentation following both Janine and Sylvie's great presentation. It really ties everything together nicely. And what wonderful work you both are doing. Really, really amazing. And I think it really exemplifies the fact that qualitative research really is a unique way to understand phenomena outside of the quantitative world, which is, Likert scales and so on. But these narratives that you shared, Annie and Javier, with us are so powerful that really bringing meaning to someone's life is really critical in this type of research. So thank you. I believe, Dongmei, you're going to conduct the Q&A, or would you like me to go ahead and open that up.
Yeah, you can go ahead and open up, and then
Okay.
I kept monitoring the chat question. I think like almost all the questions got answered.
Okay.
Unless you have any follow-up question, and then feel free to type it in the chat or just unmute yourself and ask.
Perfect. Or you can raise your hand. I can see that as well. So
Yeah.
would anyone like to outside, and I have to commend the chat. The chats have been fabulous, and I have so enjoyed having all of the lecturers kind of going back and forth with ideas and thoughts. Really, really helpful in really transitioning from one topic to another. Is there anyone in the participant group that would like to share any qualitative work they're doing or ask our scholars any questions?
Hi, I would like to ask some questions if I can.
Sure, please do.
Yeah, my name is Catherine. Hi, thank you so
Catherine.
much for your presentation. So just a little bit of background. I also am part of a community-based participatory research group in the emergency medicine department, and we are focused on the Hispanic Latino community in East San Jose. And we work with community partners as well to better help and understand the barriers and the experiences the Latino community has when accessing mental health services. So I thought we could relate a lot with what you were sharing. I think some of the questions I had was one, I think I heard you mention that at some point in the analysis, you took the codes and you were able to like share that back to the community and get feedback from them. Could you explain a little bit more about that? I'm very curious to hear about that.
Yeah, we're still in the process of kind of engaging community members and folks that shared their stories with us. But originally what we had been doing is sharing these conceptual models alongside the quotes that really exemplify these different parts of the model, and making sure that the overall theory that we were developing really aligned with their own lived realities. And so they were able to provide feedback on that. And then we also kind of delved a little deeper into the actual quotes that we chose to kind of exemplify these different working parts of the model to make sure that they also aligned with what we were trying to get at. So I think it was a fairly informal, relaxed process. And I think because we have been with this community partners for so long, and we have started to build these connections with the community that it allowed us like opportunity and access to really engage in these conversations in like an authentic and deep way. But we are still in the midst of it. And I don't know if we're gonna kind of shift how we're gonna do it, but that's how we originally kind of structured these kind of member checking meetings.
Thank you. That's actually really nice to hear how the process was, and I appreciate that. And then I guess maybe just one question I have left would just be more of like this approach that I'm thinking, and I just maybe like some feedback. So we're a 5-year grant study, and so we administer a community survey to the community, knocking on doors, and we collect about 1,000 surveys in a year. We just did 1 year last year, and we just finished year 2 this year, and I'm tasked with doing the qualitative analysis of community recommendations on what they think could be useful to improve mental health services. I've built codes from year 1 survey results, and I'm wondering if using a deductive approach to like use those codes from last year and apply to this year would be the best way, or if I should just go on doing like an inductive kind of approach as well and building new codes, or I don't know if anybody has any recommendations for that.
Sylvia, do you want to take that? Do you want me to take that?
I was answering a chat, so can you take it?
Okay, yeah, no, absolutely. I think you could absolutely do that and think about what the purposes and the differences across the different time points for which you're collecting data. And so if at time point 1 with the particular code book that you have, if you have a similar purpose for time point 2, then you can actually absolutely use that same code book and potentially add to it, as there might be different things that come up in the second year of data collection. So you could have an evolving, you can build off the original code book. And then when you present the data, depending on the intent of what you're trying to do, you can show, you know, the different ways in which themes emerged across the 2 time points for a particular code. So you could have a matrix of sorts that shows, instead of, we often talk about comparing and contrasting participants. In this way, you would actually be comparing and contrasting the themes across the different time points. So you can imagine that their thinking might evolve, their ideas, their barriers, their perceptions could evolve over time, and you can show that by having used the same codes, because you can pull the data for those 2 codes separately, time 1 and 2, and then look at them uniquely.
Thank you. That's very nice. Thank you.
If it's okay, I just wanted to add one more comment about your first comment. So I added it in the chat about participant validation, that it's so very important if you can do it, and be really authentic to what your participants have to say or how they interpret the data. But just from a practical standpoint, I just wanted to share that if you have IRB approval for that participant validation, you can actually record the session. We've had multiple people do that, and Sylvia and I have had experience. And then, you know, you do all the same questions you would ask, like, you know, what do you see? Is this a good reflection? Do you have things that we should change and adapt? What are some implications? The difference is if you have IRB approval for it, that can actually be included into your results. So instead of just saying in your methods, we did participant validation, cite, we, you know, got their input, we revised themes, we discussed blah, 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 blah. You can actually say that and have a table that might be recommendations or implications that's linked to your findings, but has some real quotes from the participants themselves.
I'm really good. That's a great comment, Janine. And just to segue off of that, just a tad, Catherine, on that first question, is this idea of member checking, like Dr. Bruce is mentioning, gives a lot of rigor to your study and can actually be part of your manuscript. And the other thing on that note is you can also do what's called going back to key informants, which I really like to do sometimes, where I have someone that has a story to tell and they're giving me such rich data. You can, if of course it's in your IRB, go back to that person. And I do that a lot with kids. Sometimes I just want to talk to that adolescent again. You can go back to a key informant. So that's another way of adding some rigor and substantiating your findings. I just wanted to add that. There's so many good chats going on. Do you want Janine or Sylvia or one of the scholars on the line, do you want to address the idea of your sample size and participant? You mentioned saturation, and Sylvia, I don't know if that needs to be maybe further described, or is that well answered? How many participants do you need to do a qualitative study? I think that's a really valid question.
Yeah. I totally agree. And unfortunately, I think it's an unsatisfying answer of it depends.
Yeah.
And I think it goes back to our prior presentations, right? Where it depends on your research question, your resources, what is it you're trying to learn, and also how are you uncovering that information from your participants and what processes you're using, right? So you can
Absolutely.
It unfortunately is that's why qualitative research is such a it's a beauty of to design. I really enjoy designing qualitative research studies because you have to really truly understand what you're trying to gain from the project to help advise and gain insight into sort of what's the best way and how to make it the most rigorous in terms of like what your ultimate aims and goals are. So that's a long answer.
No, thank you for that. I think it's important.
Really important. Well, I was just going to add, it's really important in your methods section for a qualitative project, it should be literally peppered with citations. And because there's so much variability and so much opportunity to describe different approaches to what you're doing, from collection to analysis, being able to defend why you might have a really small sample size, being able to defend why you're doing that through the literature as best as we can will be one way to help when a reviewer is like, this is a really small sample size. Are you sure it's sufficient? You can go back to the literature and your methods and say, we did it this way because this is a really hard to reach population. We have seen other studies that did qualitative work using, a more rich data collection approach where we talked to the participants multiple times. We did observations. There's so many ways that you can describe and defend your work, but it needs to be backed up with citations.
A good point. Thank you, Janine. Anyone else have a question that you'd like to bring up to our group? All right. Oh, there we have a hand up. And Vesh.
Hi everyone. My
Hello.
name's Anvesh, and I can just give you a brief background. I'm a researcher with Professors Jenna Davis, who's in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering, and Professor Gary Darmstadt. And we are actually working on a qualitative study. It's part of it's a child study under an RCT that we're conducting in northern India in primary government schools. And essentially what we are doing is using a systems approach to compare and contrast water and sanitation service delivery in primary government schools to a positive deviant, as we'd like to call it, in the same context. So there is another system within the same context where everyone complains that their water systems are broken, their sanitation systems are broken, children don't have access to these. But these same schools actually have well-functioning food delivery systems. And so we just ask a simple question of why is that working in the same environment where this is failing all the time. So essentially, we are using a grounded theory approach, and I'd always be happy to connect about it. But I think right now, so I was on field last year for about 3 to 4 months, and we conducted a lot of interviews with respondents on field, and we've sort of we're done with the coding. But I think just going back to the slide that you spoke about, the whole process of open coding, axial coding, and selective coding. I think so. I've tried to go through literature, and I've tried to go through resources that talk about, I know somebody here referenced Saldana, so Saldana is a great reference, but I think I just get confused or overwhelmed with the number of codes that we have, and just thinking about how do you streamline those codes towards these big broad themes that you make? I know it's a very broad question, and I don't want to open Pandora's box right now, but I think just the how-to process, when you go from, you're done with the initial bucketing of these codes, but then how do you proceed further? Because there's so many ways that you can go in this, and I think it's just making me lose focus towards, what is that one overarching theory, or what are the themes that can emerge from this?
Great question. Thank you, Anvesh. I'm going to have our qualitative scholars, Sylvia or Janine, address that question for you. And it's great to see engineers doing qualitative research, I'd just like to say.
Yes.
Janine or Sylvia, do you want to address that question?
Yeah, either one of us. Sylvia, do you want to, or you want me to?
I'll start. First of all, congratulations on that project. That's like a giant project, and it's also well needed. And what an interesting way to see sort of like what's broken or what's the disconnect when there's things that are working well. So those are the types of like organizational projects that I really, really enjoy. So the short answer to your question is that if you're feeling like you have too many codes, you have too many codes, right? It's important that you're tagging or identifying things that are really important, which you're doing. But at some point there's just too much, if there's too many that are examples of the same facet, like they're just like different facets of the same idea, then those should start to be sort of put together into sort of like one larger bucket. That might be one way to start looking at it. Like or if there's some codes that are more process codes, like you're looking at like an organizational chart system, like you might put them into those various time points as well, like where the disconnect might be. So it depends on the lens that you're going to be looking at. And for that, like you might be looking at, like school level, or it could be like road structure, or it could be distribution center, right? Like that might be something you might want to start sort of parsing out. So especially if you're trying to see where this disconnect is occurring, and then of course, is it a real disconnect or not, right? Like, because perceptions could be actuality. So those could be two different ways to start sort of lumping codes together. And you can do that in your software, right? Like you can start like combining and collating the codes and making sure that the upcoding feature is on either in Deduce or in Vivo. And to make sure that you're not losing sort of that tag. And of course, memo on this, right? Like memo that you're doing this, you're coalescing, you're working through the process, etc. And then the next step is something actually that Janine does a really good job explaining, which is this sort of like pulling this idea from codes to themes of of looking at these sort of like grouped codes together to see what is important about them, or what's the commonality across them, starting to put that into some sort of table format so that you can sort of really quickly visualize what's going on. Because as you probably have been feeling when you're coding in the process, you're looking at each individual data document, right? So you're looking at one individual. So you're doing this deep dive into each individual. The coding process starts making that what's happening across all participants. You start to see like what each participant or participant type, student and teacher is different from like a district organizer, right? What they're seeing across. And so you start to think about like how you want to look at that information and who is the relevant speaker that's present and how they're providing information. But I'll let Janine continue on that process.
Thank you.
Really, the only thing that I would add is that you have you can have a lot of detailed codes, or you can have some broader codes. Some people have a purpose for having a lot of detailed codes, which we call child or grandchild codes. Having too many of those nuanced codes can be something that could potentially drive you and your co-coders crazy during the coding process, because you're like, oh, does it fit in this one or that one? I call them buckets. I'm like, I think it's that bucket, but it straddles both buckets. That can literally drive you nuts. And what Sylvia and I say to our students is that, you can have broader codes that encapsulate multiple like nuanced things. And I guarantee you during the theme analysis process, you will see these specific elements emerge, and they almost become more examples versus actual overarching thematic ideas. And so if you find that you have a code that maybe only has 2 or 3 and others have, much more substance, you might consider thinking about, are these kind of codes really more part of a larger coding bucket? And I'll tease out these nuances during the theme analysis process.
Thank you, Dr. Bruce. Thank you, Dr. Merrill. Great answer to a big question. And Vesh, thank you for that question. I think it also addresses Vivian's son had a similar question earlier on, and I hope that addressed her question as well. I think we're running out of time, Dongmei. I think I need to keep us on a time. So it has been so nice having all of you here. And I want to congratulate all of you for taking an interest in qualitative research. It's a wonderful way to answer questions about people's perspectives, beliefs, and attitudes. So thank you very much for your participation. And if you want any other questions, this will be this seminar will be tape recorded on the MCHRI website for you to view at any time or share with your colleagues. Thank you very much. And Dongmei, did you want us to stay on this call?
Let's join another call.
Okay.